our mortality is a biological reality. It's not to some extent any different than the color or the lack of my hair and the lack of my height. It's just there. And I could deny it and I pretend it's not real, but it's a delusion.
Dr. Philip J Cozzolino is a social psychologist. Philip studies the motivated social cognitive processes on which individuals rely to make sense of themselves and the world. In particular, he explores the varied ways in which individuals attempt to find a balance between satisfying internal needs and motives while also satisfying and living up to the obligations of external social demands. In this episode, we talk with Philip about how denial and distance from death has become our default response and how this isn't healthy. He also discusses with us how thinking about death in the abstract and thinking about your own death are fundamentally different, how post-traumatic growth builds resilience, and how having a strong recognition of birth and death as bookends lets you have the in-between, your life as yours to live. Please support the show by liking and sharing this episode on social media, and to make sure you don't miss out on any future episodes, please sign up for our newsletter at deathhangout.com. Now, get ready for this episode, the bit between birth and death.
We started, Keith and I, this podcast about death with the idea that we need to look at death consciously because it will help our life somehow. This is our thing. And we don't have any background or scientific background at all. It's just an intuition. The question is, are we wrong, totally wrong, or are we right by doing this?
I told my students in the class that I run this autumn term, I think everything we do, I start with the premise that everything we do is wrong in terms of our research and our science. I think that's probably the best place to be scientifically. Okay. It's not exactly how it plays out because we're human and people have positions that they want to protect and defend and advance. But I just generally think that right and wrong isn't the place, this isn't the place to discuss right or wrong. But I do think where you are correct is intuition. Don't discount intuition, right? I think if it's there at an intuitive level, there's probably something there. And then we come over the top of that and we start overthinking, post hoc thinking and control it and say, well, that can't be right because of all these extra reasons that it seemed to make sense that I've heard or I've picked up along the way. But I actually think sometimes that gut response is probably telling you something that's, at least from a scientist's perspective, something you ought to pursue. Maybe not even from a scientist's perspective, maybe just in general. All that said, generally speaking, yeah, obviously my perspective and what I've been able to do as a social psychologist is largely driven by the fact that I think, and the data that we and others have collected suggest it's beneficial to, I always want to choose this word carefully because my instinct is to say embrace, and I'm not sure that's the right word, but to certainly accept, integrate, and contemplate our mortality much more so than we do as a default sort of position. And again, that the fact that it's a default position doesn't mean that it's a bad thing. It may be important for it to be the default position. I think the problem is that we allow the sort of denial and distancing ourselves from the issue to become the response, the only response that we have. And I think inevitably that leads, and again, theoretically from my perspective, but also empirically in terms of research we've conducted and others as well, it just long term, that's not a healthy way forward at an existential sort of self level.
I think from just everything you're saying there, again, our premise or our if you like, our proposal or suggestion, whatever you want to call it, is that sort of acknowledging, embracing, accepting contemplation of death just changes the decisions we make in our life. It changes what we value. It changes the importance of the things we do, and almost keeps us connected and aligned with our real selves, if you like. Just from your research and data and stuff, what have you found that would sort of back up or or go against that kind of premise?
Let's take the opposite, the denial, the pushing it away, the distancing, sort of the Becker kind of terror management theory sort of view of what's important and how to deal with mortality, or how we deal with mortality, is denial and defense. I say often, if you have a friend that's 5'7", bald, not particularly Hollywood good looking, and every time that you come across this friend, he says, and he refers to himself as some 6'2" godlike creature with flowing locks of hair, and seriously means it, right, in some sense. And I know this is, drawing a ridiculous sort of example, but you at some point, after you'd realize this isn't just a joke, like this is becoming a delusion, right? You would start saying, Philip, what's going on? Like there's a reality, biological reality about who you are that you are simply not accepting, embracing. And at some point you'd want to have that conversation about why is it that this is a delusion that you're holding on to. And our mortality is a biological reality. It's just, it's not to some extent any different than the color or the lack of my hair and the lack of my height. It's just there. And I could deny it and I pretend it's not real, but it's a delusion. Not that differently from any other delusion that I might have about myself. So I think at the end of the day, if you want an authentic, holistic, sort of conscious conception of who you are, it has to involve your mortality. It has to involve the fact that you are a limited time-only product. Now, my research and the research I've done with Laura Blackie and others around, other people besides ourselves have done some of my work or incorporated my work, has demonstrated some of this. And one particular study that I'll point to in there's three, but the one that I think is the most sort of relevant is it's a study where we asked people, it replicated the design from Netta Weinstein and the self-termination theory folks. I have a manipulation called death reflection. We generally will pit that into some sense against a classic mortality science manipulation, which is a terror management theory experimental paradigm, and then a control condition. And then after that, we asked people, so randomly assigned to one of those three conditions, we asked people to recall 3 events in their lives. One event that was very positive for them, and they wrote a page by hand about that event that was really meaningful and positive, answered some questions about it. Turn the page, these were all sort of counterbalanced, the order that people got them. Write about an event that was really negative, even shameful about your past, that really impacted you, right? And then write about it, answer the same questions. And then write about the third one, which was always the last. We just counterbalanced the positive, negative, which was write about a completely mundane, meaningless event from your life. So, think I brush my teeth, right? It just means nothing. And then answer the same questions. Now, the questions that they answered after each of these retelling of these events were basically 4 or 5 items that's got to the heart of, is this past event a part of who you are today? Has it helped shape who you are? The idea being that all things that are important and meaningful, be they good, be they bad, should, if we are being honest and authentic about ourselves, we should be able to say, yeah, of course, I was informed by that. It was a shameful, terrible thing, but how could it not have shaped who I am? What we found was that the manipulation that is the mortality science manipulation, coming from terror management theory, which is a theory that, again, from our perspective, my model's perspective, suggests activates and motivates a denial defensive approach to mortality. We saw a significant increase in people saying the positive event, that's absolutely who I am. But those individuals in that condition were much less likely, and in fact, they were pushing and distancing themselves away from that negative, shameful event, saying, no, that's not a part of who I am today. My manipulation, the death reflection manipulation, which is meant to make people sort of confront, embrace, not able to run away from their mortality, both of those were significantly higher than the mundane conditions. So the positive were equal in both conditions, but the negative one was only embraced by the death reflection folks. And then the control group was actually low on both. And I think from our perspective, that was what we were suggesting is that if you want a holistic, authentic conception of the self, you have to be existentially engaged. In our simple little experimental paradigm, we create this manipulation that we think gets people for a moment engaged with their reality, their existential reality. And what it led to was a sort of an acceptance of, yeah, of course, how could the bad thing not be an important part of who I'm today? How could I not have been formed, shaped, learned from that experience as much as the positive? Biased response from the mortality science folks, no, have to distance myself from anything shameful, negative, only want to see the positives, right? Because they're at that point needing this comfort, needing this protection, but it's a inauthentic view of the self. It's actually denying some majorly important event from their past. And in fact, and then this is the end of this, they distance themselves so far from that shameful event that, unlike even the control group, they're sort of responding to the dependent variable on that shameful event was no different from their responding to the mundane sort of brushing my teeth event. They distanced themselves so far from it that they basically equated it to meaninglessness. I mean, literally, the way in which cognitively they are thinking about themselves is clearly at that moment not authentic and not holistic.
You said death reflection and
Yeah.
death science.
Mortality salience is the
Yeah.
terror management manipulation,
Right.
right?
So to me, death reflection is to be consciously aware of death. Is it like this is it? So basically, you think about that consciously. Mortality science is unconscious death trigger. Is it like this?
It can be, right? So terror management theorists have used mortality science in subliminal primes. They've done it in very subtle ways, like getting people to fill out measures next to a supermarket versus next to a cemetery or a funeral home, right? So very sort of in the background, it's just there. But most often it's become this too open-ended question manipulation that you ask people, what do you think about when you think about death? And what do you think specifically happens to you physically when you die? So it isn't, they are aware that they're asking or answering questions about death. My manipulation is a 300-word scenario where you read and you're asked to imagine prior to the scenario that this event is actually occurring to you. And in this scenario, you basically die. I mean, it's a fire in an apartment building. You can't get out of the room. It's unavoidable. It's no one's fault. But by the time it's over, it's clear that you are dying and will be dead. You never actually, I can't write, this is what it's like to die, because then it gets into, do I see the light? Right? No, it's like basically at the end, you know this is the end, right? And then there's some open-ended questions just to reinforce some of the important points of the manipulation from our perspective. So those are the two key areas. And now what I argue is that at some level, it may be a subtle distinction, but what I think is happening is that the classic mortality science manipulation is, in a sense, asking people, what do you think about death? Whereas what I'm attempting to do, based on a literature of post-traumatic growth and near-death experiences and people who have terminal illnesses, there's like a literature I pulled from when I created this manipulation. I'm trying to get people to say, not what do you think about death? I'm trying to get them to think about, what do you think about your death? And even though that sounds very subtle, the way I usually describe it is if I said to someone, tell me about dreams, I think, and I'm guessing that you'd get this kind of dreams. Oh, okay. So, wow, there are these things that happen at night where you have images and you hear things and maybe it's memory, right? You're trying to describe this vague concept that even people who study it don't quite know what it is. But if I then said, okay, all right, tell me about the dream you had last night. Then people are like, oh, well, okay. So I was flying and that was weird. But then I suddenly was sitting down next to my grandparents and I haven't seen them in a while. And they would be like immersed in a description and an experience, right? And I think at the end of the day, that's what I'm trying to do. I'm trying to capture that difference between this abstract notion that's very difficult to wrap your head around, plus it's kind of scary, distinguish that from it's real, it's possible, you will experience it someday, so let's just get you there as close as we can right now.
Just in terms of the impact of that, as you said, that more subjective experience of it, rather than the abstract, objective, trying to describe it. As part of your research, have you looked at maybe the impact that has on people and how they live their life and decisions they make?
From our perspective, we're just doing one-off, simple little experimental sort of conditions. We haven't had the opportunity to do anything long-term. The work that I pull from, that I generated my death reflection, this goes back to 2000, and the first paper on this was in 2004. I was designing and creating the experiment in 2001. It took me a while to finally get kind of going. I was a grad student. All that work that came was all from, like I said, people who, like, not just started anecdotally, people who were having near-death experiences, people who were having post-traumatic growth experiences. I was reading a lot of these reports. Then I found, once I went to start a grad program, I found actual researchers like Kenneth Ring, who's a PhD social psychologist from Minnesota, where I got my PhD, who basically has made his career in trying to scientifically understand the experience of people who believe they've died and come back from that experience, as well as like Tedeschi and Calhoun. They've done this post-traumatic growth work, and all lots of people, Pat Fraser, have done people who have done work with people who have experienced trauma and believed they were going to die. Didn't see light, wasn't like that, but just, at some point, whether it could be anything, it could be from genocide to earthquakes to being attacked and raped, whatever it is, right? Post-traumatic growth. Some trauma has occurred, and basically your everything you know and all your protections are just shattered. And all this kind of literature, people with terminal illnesses, and what I kept seeing in it was just this resilient, terrible immediate reactions, right? I say this in my writing. It's not like, oh, this is all positive stuff, right? Go get some trauma, people. No, it's right. It's horrible. And one of the ways in which someone described it once, I wrote about him in one of my papers. He said, he goes, I experienced a grief, the kind of which I had never known. The pain was greater than any of the cancer pain I was experiencing. This notion of seeing the end, like the death was now like right in front of me, because it was a terminal illness for this person. So there's real hardcore psychological, emotional trauma that they go through, but there is a resilience, and there is a reward for that pain that existentially it's not 100%, nothing is, but it is recurring through all these different domains, whether it's post-traumatic growth, near-death experiences, terminal illnesses. The vast majority of these individuals come through this experience changed. They want to be better than they were. They want to take they reboot. They look back and they think, how did I get to where I am now? And what is it that I want to change? There are a lot of divorces because people realize, oh, I'm in relationships that I'm just not happy. We're not in love anymore. They quit jobs. They go back to school. There is like a complete rebooting. And it's almost as if to say, you know what? I actually I'm not dead. I get a chance to grab a hold again, right? For some reason, I let control go. I let other things dictate some of my choices and decisions. But I get that time now. I get to have that opportunity, and it's that sort of agentic, sort of intrinsic motivational state that we were trying to get at right from the beginning.
That is fascinating, and as you said, it's such a traumatic, painful, cathartic experience in that sense. But the changes are really positive in that clarity that people get when they look at their lives. As you said, where am I now? How did I get here? That realization, that sudden understanding of mortality is there, and that there's a chance to now live a more authentic life, to wake up, to switch off the autopilot, to do what you want to do. It sort of fits into what we're trying to achieve with this podcast. It's how do we get to that place without the trauma?
That was exactly my question. To say, okay,
well, there you go.
Shall we all go to this kind of traumatic experience, or can we have it like gently?
Yes. Yeah, I think inherently that you can, right? I mean, that's sort of, we started this with your intuition that told you that was true. And that is true, right? This gentleman, Bill Bartholomew, is the guy I'm referring to. He was a cancer patient who was covered in a Bill Moyers documentary in PBS in North America some years ago, 2004 maybe. And he talks about that. He says, why didn't I understand this all along? It's like, why did I have to get to this point? To, the way he puts it, and this is being poetic and it gets people a little bit emotional, but it's the truth. And this is what he was saying. He's like, when it's fall, when it's autumn, and you're told that you're not going to see spring, and then you wake up one day and it's spring, it's not spring anymore. It's a miracle. And what he said after that was, I think we need to start thinking about life that way, that death is the thing that makes us, it gives it meaning, it gives it pizzazz, it gives it, spring is a miracle. Whether we're born terminal, right? We're all terminal, right? There isn't a single person on this planet who isn't given a death sentence the day they die. So spring every fucking year is a miracle. And all we have to kind of do, and believe me, I struggle with this massively, but all we have to try and do is remember that spring and fall and winter and everything. Life, it's not always great, and sometimes it's difficult and sometimes it's challenging, but it is so much better than non-life. It is what we have. I mean, I have a second sort of career, I say lightly, as a musician. So music means a great deal to me. And the line that I always kind of talk about is this simple little line that Eddie Vedder once wrote in one of his songs, which is, "I know I was born, I know that I'll die, the in-between is mine." And I think that's the key, is just remembering that bookend, right? And it's the bookend that lets you have the third part. It's because you know you die that the in-between is yours. What happens if you keep denying that I don't want to talk about that. Well, then you lose the ability to take control of it too, right? Because you're giving that away. That's the key for us. Is it's not trauma. It doesn't have to be a terminal illness. It's a part of the human condition. You can see it. It's possible. Yes, unfortunately, it shows up more often in people who have trauma and who have terminal illnesses. But the fact that it's occurring naturally and systematically and consistently in those sorts of individuals tells you it's possible.
There's something about musician, I guess, because we are both musicians, myself and Keith as well. We are all guitarists, so I think maybe there's this thing about that. Anyway, but
tortured artists.
Exactly, like sad songs, depressing, The Cure, Depeche Mode, all these kind of things, for sure. You said it's difficult for me. You did some research. You bang on inside this topic of death, and still it's difficult for you to say, yeah, it's maybe my last spring. It's a miracle. It's So what is that? What is this difficulty? What is this mechanism inside of our head just to push that away? This defense mechanism that we need basically to sort of battle, really. Not to battle, but it's that difficult.
I don't know that I have an answer that is other than just, I mean, I have some expertise, but I don't have data supporting this necessarily. I think it's probably, just like as I mentioned earlier, that gut instinct is real. It's there. We have sort of this evolutionarily biological imperative to survive. We're an animal that, like anything else, wants to survive. As terror management theorists will tell you, that conflicts with this insanely developed creative ability to imagine the possibilities and even the impossible, and all of those, which allows us to understand our inevitable non-existence, and those two things conflict. And it is scary for people, right? I mean, you have to understand death and fear of death and concern of death. It's not just a sort of simple notion. There's a scale out there called the multi-dimensional fear of death scale. And I think there are 7 subscales in here, right? So you can 42, 46 items. I don't remember. I haven't used it in a while. But it's like you can literally pare down into what is it that you're afraid of? Some people don't necessarily fear death. What they fear is pain of death, right? Other people, pain of death isn't, no one embraces the idea of it, but some people don't fear death as a concept. They fear the death of others, right? That's one of the subscales. Or there's one of the subscales is fear of the dead, right? Like, I don't even want to be around blood or dead bodies, right? And even though all of these things are probably correlated to some extent, I'm simply trying to, this notion isn't just, it's binary, kind of easy. Just turn it off. Don't fear death. No, it's obviously, it's an enigma. It's this unbelievably, I used to, as an undergrad, when I was young and smoking way too much dope, I would not go to sleep. I would literally, the sun would be coming up and I would still be in bed because I would sit there trying to imagine what nothingness was, which is, of course, ridiculous and nonsense, right? And I look back now and I'm like, idiot. But the point is that it is not that. Of course we fear it. Of course there's so much about it that is unknowable, and we've constructed all these potential explanations and answers that comfort us, these worldviews, religions, and belief systems that may or may not help us get through it and may or may not be real. What a surprise that it's just the easiest thing to do is say, I'd rather not engage with the day. I have a lot to do. I've got, my phone is beeping and I've got stuff to do. If we sat down and really thought through everything about our existential realities on every given moment of every given day, we probably wouldn't do very much. At some point, you have to get in, as Keith said, to your autopilot, right? We are routinized. We have to. The problem is that this is an important bit that we never really seem to find enough time for. We don't seem to accept that that's time we need to every once in a while sit back and think, where am I? how much, not that you ever will have this answer, but how much time do I have left? Where am I? Am I achieving, doing, believing, thinking, whatever, what I set out to do? And I think you need that endpoint to kind of help you frame that question. It's hard work.
I think that's the hard work. It's not easy. And bringing it back to that trauma, it is, even to contemplate it. Since we've started doing this, I've done it more often, and it doesn't get any easier each time. When you go into that contemplation, it's like there is a terror that comes up within you. Now it does pass, but I think it's, without going through the trauma, it's almost like a vaccine kind of thing. We have to just keep giving ourselves a little dose just to keep that consciousness of it alive. And the more often we do it, the more we contemplate the decisions we're making, where we are in our life, what we're doing with it. All of those things come up. As you said, Philip, it's not something we can answer. There's an unknown element to it. We can't contemplate it. It is easier to push it away, but that's when, the more we push it away, the more we go on to autopilot. And the more we're on autopilot, the less that we're actually living. I think that's we can create small traumas, but that's scary to do. And as you said, it's hard work. It's very, very difficult to do. But what we're trying to do is get people to say it's worth it. It's worth going into that place to actually, because of the value that comes out of the other side of it.
I think that's exactly right. And it's the point I was making about the lyric before. It's if you want to truly live authentically, holistically, consciously, like I said before, with my height, my hair, and all that stuff, at some point that involves and that requires an honest conception of who you are, and you are a mortal being, right? I wrote once, and it's not because I like to talk about my writing. Obviously, I don't. Actually, it's very difficult for me. But I wrote once something. It was at the end of a chapter. I wrote, it seems to me that the best definition of death is the absence of life. But the best definition of life isn't the absence of death. It's like, and when you think about it in that context, it's actually, the mystery is life, right? It's like that's the thing that's much harder to wrap your head around if you really think about it, because death, at the end of the day, the second it happens, you're done thinking about it. You're done trying to understand it. You're done trying to, right? There's no more need for you to be trying to figure it out. So why waste your fucking time here right now, so caught up in, oh my God, Philip, why are you in bed trying to understand something that is meaningless and ridiculous? What will it be when there's nothing? When actually the thing you have right now in front of you, you haven't figured out at all. Right? That's the mystery right here, right now. And we don't do nearly enough of that. And but to do it, my theory and my model suggests, to actually dig in, to actually unpack this mystery, what we have in front of us, it does require you, or at least, at the very least, it's enhanced your ability to do it by accepting, embracing, contemplating on some regularity, and integrating the notion of your end, because that's the thing that points you back to the in-between, which is yours.
Oh, Philip, you sound really much like a spiritual teacher to me, much more like a normal teacher. But that's a compliment.
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's a very good thing. And you play the guitar, you're one step closer to become a guru, I think. But
yeah, that's so not true. But okay.
We hope you enjoyed this week's episode. Again, please support the show by signing up at deathhangout.com or clicking on the subscribe button on your screen.